Good morning. We're going to finish our Habakkuk series today, and I'm so glad we've spent some time with this book. I remember being a kid in church and being told that if you flip halfway through your Bible, you would find Psalms, and if you flipped halfway from there to the end, you would find the New Testament. And that's helpful, but I think it's emblematic of how we treat some parts of the Bible. Habakkuk is in the flip-through books, kind of like flyover states, the stuff we have to skip to get to the good bits. But that's not true, is it, about minor prophets or Missouri? Habakkuk asks, what do we do when it seems like God isn't there? A question that I expect every single person has asked at one point. I hope our recent looks at the minor prophets, Jonah and Habakkuk, have challenged you to go back and consider this part of Scripture again. That there are more to familiar stories from our childhood, and that prophets with funny names have very relevant things to say to us today. So let's flip our Bibles to Habakkuk 3, but let's make it a thoughtful flipping and remind ourselves of the story so far. God creates the world and fills it with life, and he creates humans as his image, his representatives on earth, with a mandate to care for creation and spread God's blessing. But tragically, we rebel. We let go of God's definition of what is right and take hold of our own. And our definition is selfish. We start to believe that we cannot flourish unless others fall, and trust is broken. But God is committed to humanity, committed to ruling creation with humanity. And so he makes a promise. The promise that working with and through our brokenness, he will bring reconciliation. The plan starts very small. He promises an elderly, childless couple, Abraham and Sarah, that their children will become a great nation. And through this nation, God's blessing will spread to all other nations. Through fits and starts, their family grows, and eventually they find themselves captives, slaves in Egypt. God raises up Moses and leads them out of slavery, and the people encounter God at Mount Sinai. They see smoke and fire from the mountain and hear God's voice in the fire. They enter a covenant with God, that they will be his special possession among the nations, and he will lead them to a place where they can be a nation. And they enter this place, but humanity hasn't changed since the rebellion. We want to be kings, not stewards, and through cycles of rebellion and revival, the nation decays. It fractures in civil war, and the northern part of the kingdom is conquered by the Assyrian Empire, leaving only the southern kingdom, Judah, and its capital, Jerusalem. Eventually, Assyria is itself absorbed by the Babylonian Empire, and here we encounter Habakkuk, living in Judah with corrupt kings and with the ever-growing threat of the Babylonians on their borders. In chapter 1, Habakkuk looks around and sees that things are not as they should be. Judah is not holding up their end of the covenant agreement at Mount Sinai. There is violence and corruption, and Habakkuk cries out to God, "Why do you allow this?" And God answers. It must have been about the last thing Habakkuk expected to hear. God has raised the Babylonian Empire for the purpose of bringing judgment and discipline on Judah. They will sweep in and conquer the land. Habakkuk protests. How does this improve anything? They are more violent and corrupt than Judah. God is patient with Habakkuk. He explains that the Babylonians will face their own judgment. All of our selfish definitions of right and wrong will come to an end, but a remnant of Abraham's family will be preserved. And so Habakkuk reflects on all of this in chapter 3, and he writes a song, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shagging Off. Well, we don't get very far before we got to something interesting. What is shagging off? Well, it's a Hebrew word. So a good follow-up question would be, why is there a Hebrew word in my English Bible? Well, it's because no one knows what this Hebrew word means. There are theories. If you go look at other translations, you'll see things like set to wild and enthusiastic music, and some translations just leave it out and add a footnote. But most just leave it untranslated. It's probably some kind of technical musical term. A similar word is used in Psalm 7, but really we just don't know what it means. Does this bother you? I actually kind of like it. It's humbling. It's a reminder that these documents are ancient, that we should not be too quick to claim mastery over them, that we should listen to them at least as much as we talk about them. Let's continue. O Lord, I have heard the report of you. Of your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. How does Habakkuk begin his song? Recall that the content of this book has mostly been about things that are happening, violence in Israel, and things that will happen, the judgment on that violence. But Habakkuk begins singing when he looks back. He remembers what the traditions of his people have passed down to him about what God has done. Habakkuk wants those things to happen again. When he says he's heard the report, what do you think he's talking about? In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses addresses the children of the people who were at Mount Sinai. And so it's recorded one of the first times that this report was given. And it was preserved all the way to Habakkuk, who heard it from childhood, all the way to us who can hear it now. Let's hear the report in Deuteronomy 4. For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trial, by signs, by wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown, that you might know that the Lord is God, that there is no other besides him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire. You heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them, and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in, to give you their land as an inheritance, as it is this day. Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven above, and on earth beneath. There is no other. Something incredible happened to Habakkuk's people. Something without precedent. Something that could not be explained except that the author of this world stepped in and made himself known. Something that changed them forever. Let's keep this in mind as we continue the song. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. These are place names. Teman and Mount Paran are both to the southeast of Israel, which is the direction of Mount Sinai, where the people heard God's voice and saw his great fire. It's the direction from which Israel approached their promised land. Habakkuk is connecting us back to the story of Israel's deliverance from slavery. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Here, God's approach is compared to the sun. This is really powerful imagery. What happens when the sun comes up? It fills the sky. It covers the land in light, and the earth reacts. Flowers bloom, ice melts, and creatures scurry around. It can't be ignored. And get this, and there he veiled his power. The claim here being that if God's power shines as bright as the sun, that's only the bit of his power that shines through a veil. As bright and awesome as the sun, and that's just a fraction of it. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Everything answers to God. Illness is part of his baggage train. He commands it. He surveys the earth like he owns it, because he does. He's more everlasting than the everlasting mountains. Cushan and Midian are neighboring people groups. They try to get out of the way when God goes past. They are in awe of him. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers? Or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? We're reminded here of deliverance from Egypt by the parting of the sea. The answer is no, this isn't all just for show. God has a purpose in his action, the deliverance of his people. You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. Here, we see God depicted as a mighty warrior. This warrior God image is not uncommon in the Bible, but it might make some of us uneasy. We hear Jesus talking about loving your enemy and turning the other cheek, and where is that? In the ancient world, gods were often celebrated for martial prowess, and stories about them involve winning great conflicts. The Babylonians, the people God is sending to discipline Israel, they have their own creation account. It's called the Enuma Elish. In that account, the storm god Marduk defeats the sea serpent Tiamat and rips her corpse apart to create the land and sky. In fact, most ancient god accounts are like that. The gods are locked in some sort of struggle, and one of them wins battles to assert supremacy. What's different in Genesis? There's nothing to defeat, right? God simply speaks, and it is so, because he is like no other. There's nothing to oppose him. And in this depiction of God as a warrior, we see there's no competition. The mountains, the waters, the sun and moon cannot resist him. And why is God going to war? Verse 13, for the salvation of his people. And look at the next verse. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked. Does that sound familiar? Genesis 3. God promised that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. God fights against spiritual evil for the salvation of his people. Notice that he pierces evil with its own arrows. He turns evil against itself. People have used these depictions of God as a warrior to justify their belief that there is some group of people that, if eliminated, would make the world a better place. But church, remember that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against evil. We live on occupied earth. The kingdom of heaven has already begun a liberation campaign, and there were no preparatory bombardments. There were no tanks. Who did God send as the vanguard of this liberation? The poor in spirit, the mourning, the meek, those who seek righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted. And they're armed only with the word of God and defended not with steel, but with truth, righteousness, and faith. Let's continue as Habakkuk reacts to what God has revealed to him about the Babylonian invasion. I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. This is deeply affecting. The life he knows is ending. His city will be surrounded and conquered. The people carried away into captivity. God has revealed to him that the Babylonians will eventually come to ruin, but he has to wait for it. There's no skipping past these trials. So Habakkuk names his fears. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Habakkuk lived in an agrarian society, and he's describing the end of his world. What would our version be today? Though the power goes out, and the shelves be empty, the roads crumble, and the taps run dry. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. I love this image of a deer treading on high places. Have you ever seen Planet Earth? It's one of those David Attenborough narrated nature documentaries. There's a sequence where an ibex runs across what looks like a vertical rock wall. And it's amazing that they can navigate such a dangerous place so gracefully. That's the picture. Habakkuk sees this great hardship, a time of not enough to go around, and yet he rejoices in the Lord. He is going to be as sure-footed and confident as he navigates this time of trial as a deer on a mountainside. This image also describes my reaction to this chapter. I look at the deer running on the cliff and Habakkuk rejoicing in the face of hardship, and I have the same question. How does he do that? Nothing material has changed for Habakkuk. This time of great turmoil is still coming, and he rejoices. All that bad stuff, the no food, it still seems pretty bad. How can he rejoice? Maybe he can make peace with it, stiff upper lip and all. Maybe he can accept it, but rejoice? Is it escapism? Is it head in the sandism? If you react like I do, let me suggest that you and I misunderstand two things. We misunderstand what God promises and why we can trust what he does promise. So what exactly does God promise? Let's consider Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus tells us not to worry. Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. 4 chapters later, he's sending out his disciples, and he tells them, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles." And 14 chapters later, when his disciples are marveling at the size of the temple, he tells them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And he goes on to tell them how Jerusalem will be sacked again. They will be put to death, and there will be a time of difficulty as there has never been and never will be again. I'm an anxious person. I struggle with worry. What if? So maybe you react to this differently. But when someone tells me not to worry and then gives me a list of things to worry about, I'm not sure what to do with that. It feels like they're telling me to worry. Because I realized when someone tells me not to worry, what I really want to hear is that there's nothing to worry about. And that's not what Jesus has for us. Many of you are probably aware of the prosperity gospel. I'm reluctant to give it the dignity of being called a gospel, but that is how it's known. It's the idea that Jesus is a path to material wealth. I personally have not been taken in by the prosperity gospel, the one where I'll believe my way to a private jet. But maybe I have fallen for a prosperity gospel. I'll call it the comfort gospel. The idea that God will give me an easy life. That it's not just don't worry, but nothing to worry about. It started out with me thinking, if I'm good, if I obey, I'll get that easy life. And then I learned about grace, and it became, if I have enough faith, if I trust enough, I'll have an easy life. We want those things to be related, right? We want to think that God can relieve our suffering, and so he will. That God can steer us around hardships, and so he will, if we're good, or have enough faith, or pray the right prayer. But consider, how did that work out for Jesus? He lived the only truly and completely righteous life. And he was murdered in his early 30s, executed on trumped-up charges. How did it work out for Paul? Chased out of town, imprisoned, beaten, and shipwrecked. If you're following Jesus to get an easy life, I'm sorry. That's not the promise. Please don't hear what I'm not saying, though. God is a healer. He is a comforter, and he does bring healing, and he does bring comfort. He knows each of us as his children, and he knows what we need and what we can bear. Do not stop asking our Father for deliverance from physical and emotional needs. But he does not promise freedom from those things. He promises to love us. Paul in Romans, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. That is a famous passage. I've always tended to take it as just reassurance that nothing can stop God from saving me. But that's not all it says. That those things can't separate you from the love of God means that a hard life does not mean God doesn't love you. There will be trials, and those trials do not mean God is absent. They don't mean God doesn't care. Your material situation gives no information on who God is or what he thinks about you, because you were not promised a life free from troubles. Just the opposite. We were told that following Jesus comes with troubles. Troubles that Paul says we will look back at from our place with Jesus and see them as light and momentary. And that somehow these troubles are preparing us for that day. They don't seem light and momentary now, but they will. That is the promise. Habakkuk could rejoice because he did not believe that difficulty in his life meant God didn't care about him. He understood the promise that his troubles would bring him closer to God, and he would one day look back at them and say, worth it. Now that's a big promise, right? Whatever has us lying awake at night, whatever has us anxious, depressed, weeping, that those things will one day be regarded as light and momentary. How can we trust such a huge promise? Recall how Habakkuk began to sing when he looked back, when he remembered what God had done. Why did God do it? The answer is just a few chapters later in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 7. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you. For you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know, therefore, that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. We can trust the promise because it's not contingent on who we are. It is contingent on who God is. Habakkuk was able to look back and see the miracle at Mount Sinai. Delivery from slavery, freedom from oppression, and a future as a new nation. We are able to look back and see the miracle of the empty tomb. Delivery from sin, freedom from death, and a future as a new creation. We have 10,000 times more reason to rejoice in the face of trial than Habakkuk, because we can look back to Jesus. Psychologists classify our fears into a small number of core fears. There's several models. Sometimes it's 5 core fears, sometimes it's 3. Things like abandonment and failure. The fear that is on every core fear list that I can find: death. The cross and the empty tomb silences death. Jesus is king. He proved it by walking out of that tomb. And if death bows to Jesus, so do all other fears. But what if, my anxiety says? Jesus is king of if. So why isn't it that simple? I look back, I see what Jesus has done, and poof, I'm rejoicing in God, even if my comfort is crumbling. I think it's because of how trust works. You see, we're so very tempted to make it on our own. We want to be kings, remember? That's what happened at the very beginning of the story. We want to be enough. We want to be independent. We want to be self-sustaining. To trust completely is to give up complete control. Have you ever heard of the ABSF, the American Blind Skiing Foundation? It's exactly what it sounds like. Blind people who ski. The way it works is the blind skier has a guide, a person who skis right along with them and calls out, left, right, slow down, and so on. Think about the trust dynamic in that relationship. How much does the skier rely on the guide? Entirely. How much are they able to do for themselves what the guide can do? Not at all. Now imagine you're a sighted person and you want to know what this is like. So you close your eyes and you have someone guide you down a ski slope. Would you peek? Yes, you would peek because you can see, or you think you can at least. What if the guide tells you to go right and you peek and you see what looks like a cliff on the right? Which way do you go? Who knows the mountain? You or the guide who does this every day? The guide does, right? And you know that, intellectually. But it sure looks like he's steering you off a cliff. Which way do you go? Do you trust your eyes or the guide? Unless you are empty of the quality needed to ski down that hill, you will never fully, completely, entirely trust that guide. As long as we think we have any ability to fulfill the promise, any ability to do for ourselves what only God can do, we won't trust Him. Not entirely. Especially not when it seems like maybe He sent us the wrong way. We'll peek. We'll second guess. Let me be clear. We're talking about rejoicing in hardship. Someone might hear me and think, if I don't trust God like that blind skier trusts the guide, I'm doing it wrong. But your salvation doesn't work like that. If you drive across a bridge, you're trusting it to hold you up. You can trust it completely and drive right across, or you can barely trust it and white knuckle and hyperventilate your way across. Either way, it holds you up. So Habakkuk rejoices when the calamity comes. How does he do it? Because he understands that the calamity does not get in the way of the promise. The promise made by a God who has proven He is faithful to His promises, who guarantees His promises by His power and not ours. Jesus is the ultimate mountain guide because He's been down the mountain and knows it perfectly. By His perfect life and death, He earned the right to guide us. It's difficult to trust, to empty ourselves of our need to be kings. But let's take one step in that direction and sing like Habakkuk.